Have you ever stopped to wonder where our everyday phrases come from? The expressions we use without a second thought often hide stories far darker and more fascinating than we could imagine. From fears of premature burial to gruesome public executions, from toxic hat-making to battlefield carnage, the origins of our common sayings reveal a world of horror, desperation, and dark humor. Today we're embarking on a journey into the shadowy underbelly of language itself. We'll uncover the shocking truths behind phrases you've used countless times, exploring how fear, violence, compassion, and even dark comedy have shaped the way we speak. Brace yourself as we pull back the curtain on linguistic history you never knew existed. Let's begin our exploration with a phrase that might make you think twice the next time you use it. You're pulling my leg. When someone says, "You're pulling my leg," they're suggesting you're joking or teasing them. It's a lighthearted phrase we use daily, but its origins are anything but cheerful. One chilling theory takes us back to 18th and 19th century London, to a place called Tyburn, one of the city's most notorious execution sites. Here, condemned criminals faced the terrifying sentence of hanging, and for some, the even more horrific fate of being drawn and quartered. The execution method was deliberately designed to be slow and agonizing. Victims were hung briefly, not long enough to kill them, before being taken down to face further unspeakable tortures. Imagine the horror of dangling from the gallows, choking but not dying, knowing what terrible fate awaited you next. In this bleak landscape of human cruelty, an unexpected act of mercy emerged. Friends and family members of the condemned would gather at these public executions, but not just as passive witnesses. In a desperate attempt to spare their loved ones from prolonged suffering, they would rush forward and literally pull on the legs of the hanging person. This pulling of the legs served a grim but compassionate purpose. By adding their weight, they would hasten death, ensuring their loved one died quickly by hanging rather than surviving to face the torture that followed. It was an act of love in the midst of barbarity, a final gift of a swift death instead of drawn-out agony. However, there's an alternative theory that places the origin in a slightly different context. Some historians suggest the phrase comes from mid-19th century Victorian London's criminal underworld. During this era, pickpockets developed a cunning tactic. They would trip their intended victims by pulling or hooking their legs, causing them to stumble and fall. In the confusion and distraction of the fall, the thieves would quickly rifle through pockets and make off with valuables. Whether born from mercy or mischief, pulling someone's leg has traveled a long journey from its dark origins to become the playful expression we know today. Peeping Tom. The term peeping Tom for someone who indulges in forbidden voyeurism has become so common that we rarely question its origin. But this phrase is rooted in one of England's most audacious legends, the story of Lady Godiva. In 11th century England, Lady Godiva was the noble wife of Leofric, the Earl of Mercia. She was deeply troubled by the oppressive taxes her husband had imposed on the poor citizens of Coventry. The people were suffering, and Lady Godiva pleaded with her husband to reduce the burden. Leofric, perhaps thinking his wife would never agree, made her an outrageous proposal. He would reduce the taxes, he said, but only if she rode through the town completely naked. It was meant to be an impossible condition, a way to silence her appeals without actually having to agree to her request. But Lady Godiva shocked him by accepting the challenge. However, she made one request of the townspeople, that they stay indoors with their shutters closed and avert their eyes as she passed, out of respect for her sacrifice on their behalf. The legend tells us that the grateful citizens agreed. As Lady Godiva embarked on her daring ride through Coventry, the streets were empty, the windows shuttered, and the people stayed indoors as promised. All except one. A man named Tom, unable to resist his curiosity, drilled a hole in his shutter or peeked through a crack to catch a forbidden glimpse of the naked noblewoman. According to different versions of the story, his punishment was swift and severe. Some say he was struck blind the moment he looked. Others claim he was struck dead on the spot, divine retribution for his disrespect. From that moment, Tom became known as Peeping Tom, and his name has lived on in infamy for nearly 1,000 years. It's worth noting that much of this story exists in the realm of legend rather than documented history. The tale has evolved and been embellished over centuries of retelling. Historical evidence for Lady Godiva's ride is thin, and the character of Tom doesn't appear in the earliest versions of the story, being added several centuries later. But whether the story is historical fact or mythical yarn, Peeping Tom has secured his place in our language as a cautionary tale about the consequences of violating privacy and trust. It's a fascinating example of how legend, morality, and language intertwine to create expressions that endure through the ages. Mad as a Hatter. We all know and love the zany Mad Hatter from Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, with his nonsensical riddles and chaotic tea parties. But did you know that the phrase "mad as a Hatter" has a tragically real historical basis? In the 18th and 19th centuries, felt hats were incredibly fashionable. These hats were made from animal fur, typically beaver or rabbit, which had to be transformed into felt through a complex manufacturing process. The problem was that this process involved using mercury nitrate, a highly toxic substance. Hatters, the skilled artisans who crafted these fashionable accessories, worked in cramped, poorly ventilated workshops. Day after day, year after year, they were exposed to mercury vapors as they treated the fur and shaped the felt. They had no protective equipment, no understanding of the danger they were in, and no regulations to protect them from occupational hazards. Over time, mercury poisoning took a devastating toll on their health. Mercury is a neurotoxin that accumulates in the body, and chronic exposure leads to a condition called mercurialism or mercury poisoning. The symptoms were both physical and psychological. Tremors, loss of coordination, slurred speech, memory problems, and dramatic changes in personality and behavior. Affected hatters would often display erratic, irrational behavior. They might become anxious, irritable, or suffer from hallucinations. Some of them would experience wild mood swings or show signs of what appeared to be madness. Their hands would shake uncontrollably, a condition known as hatter's shakes. In severe cases, they might lose teeth, develop kidney problems, or suffer permanent brain damage. To their communities, these hatters genuinely appeared to be going mad. They didn't understand that it was the mercury causing these symptoms. They simply observed that hatters, more than people in other professions, seemed prone to developing strange, irrational behaviors. Thus, the phrase "mad as a hatter" entered the language. Lewis Carroll, whose real name was Charles Dodgson, almost certainly knew about this occupational hazard when he created his memorable character. His Mad Hatter, with his confused speech, obsession with time, and bizarre behavior, may well have been inspired by the real victims of mercury poisoning that Carroll would have known about or even encountered. The use of mercury in hat making continued well into the 20th century. It wasn't until 1941 that mercury was finally banned from the felt-making process in the United States, and other countries followed suit. By that time, countless hatters had suffered the effects of this toxic exposure, their tragic condition immortalized in a phrase that has outlived the dangerous practice that spawned it. Baker's dozen. We've all experienced the pleasant surprise of a baker's dozen, that generous 13th roll or bagel we sometimes receive. It seems like a charming tradition of generosity, but the origin of this practice is rooted in fear and a rather gruesome medieval law. This story takes us back to 13th century Britain and a strict decree known as the Assize of Bread and Ale. This wasn't just a guideline or suggestion, it was serious legislation that regulated the price, weight, and quality of bread and ale, two staples of the medieval diet. Under this law, bakers faced severe penalties if they were caught selling undersized of poor quality bread to their customers. And when I say severe, I mean truly horrific. Bakers who cheated their customers could face public flogging, heavy fines, or in the most serious cases, having their hands chopped off. Imagine losing your hands, the very tools of your trade, for selling a loaf that was a bit too light. This wasn't an idle threat either. There are historical records of bakers being punished under this law. The authorities were serious about protecting consumers from being cheated, even if their methods seem barbarically harsh by.
Faced with such dire consequences, bakers came up with an ingenious solution. Bread making is an imprecise art. Even with the best intentions, slight variations in dough, baking time, and temperature could result in loaves of slightly different weights. A batch that seemed fine when it went into the oven might come out a hair under the legal weight requirement. To protect themselves from accusations of cheating and the terrible punishments that could follow, bakers began the practice of adding an extra item to every dozen they sold. This 13th piece, the baker's dozen, served as insurance. Even if one or two of the loaves were slightly underweight, the extra one would ensure that the total exceeded the required amount. This practice spread throughout medieval Europe and has persisted for centuries, long after the brutal punishments that inspired it have been abolished. Today, when a baker or shop owner throws in an extra item, they're continuing a tradition that was born from craftspeople's fear of losing their hands. It's a perfect example of how a phrase or custom can outlive the dark circumstances that created it, transforming from a desperate protective measure into what we now see as a generous gesture of goodwill. Wreaking havoc. When we say someone is wreaking havoc, we're describing chaos and disorder. But this phrase has a chilling military origin that takes us back to medieval battlefields. Havoc was originally a battlefield cry used by Anglo-Norman soldiers during medieval warfare. It wasn't just a random shout or battle cry, it had a specific and terrifying meaning. When a commander gave the order to cry havoc, it was essentially giving soldiers permission to engage in unlimited slaughter, destruction, and pillaging. This cry signaled that all restraint was removed. Soldiers were free to kill indiscriminately, destroy property, steal whatever they wanted, and generally unleash complete devastation upon the enemy's forces and lands. It was a license for uncontrolled violence and plunder. The practice was so brutal and destabilizing that it eventually came to be seen as counterproductive and barbaric, even by medieval standards. In the 14th century, during the reign of King Richard II of England, the cry of havoc was officially outlawed in military operations. Richard II's statute stated that anyone who raised or responded to the cry of havoc would face execution by beheading. The reasoning was that such uncontrolled violence made it impossible to maintain military discipline, complicated efforts to negotiate surrender or peace, and often resulted in the destruction of resources and populations that could have been valuable to the victorious side. Despite being outlawed, the phrase havoc remained in the English language, gradually losing its specific military meaning and becoming a general term for chaos and destruction. Shakespeare famously used it in Julius Caesar when Mark Antony declares, "Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war," invoking the old battlefield cry to predict the chaos that would follow Caesar's assassination. Today, when we talk about someone wreaking havoc, few people realize they're echoing a medieval military command that once meant unrestricted carnage. Blockbuster. Today, the word blockbuster conjures images of massive movie successes and entertainment franchises worth billions. But this cheerful modern usage obscures the term's explosive origin in the fiery chaos of World War II. During that global conflict, blockbuster had a very different and literal meaning. It referred to massive bombs, particularly those used by the British Royal Air Force. These weren't ordinary bombs, they were monsters. Blockbusters were essentially huge cylinders, each weighing over 12,000 pounds, roughly equivalent to the weight of an adult African elephant. They were packed with powerful high explosives and designed to cause maximum destruction over a wide area. The term blockbuster itself was coined by the American press to describe these weapons' awesome and terrifying destructive power. A single blockbuster bomb had the capacity to obliterate entire city blocks, destroying not just individual buildings, but whole neighborhoods. The shock wave alone could shatter windows hundreds of yards away, and the blast could turn multi-story buildings to rubble in seconds. These weapons were used in bombing campaigns over German cities, where they created firestorms and widespread devastation. The psychological impact was almost as important as the physical damage. The mere knowledge that such weapons existed created fear far beyond the actual blast zones. After the war, the term blockbuster began to migrate